This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're tackling a listener request and diving into something I know a lot of us find fascinating. How World War II completely reshaped the U.S. economy.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
It is, and we'll be using an episode of Mr. Hutchings History as our guide for this one. They always do such a good job getting into the nitty-gritty.
Absolutely, and it's one of those turning points in history where, you can't just talk about the battles and the weapons. We're going to see how America really went from those depths of the Great Depression to becoming the economic powerhouse we know today.
All in the space of just a few years.
Exactly, a very compressed timeline.
So maybe we can start by setting the scene. Paint us a picture of America in 1941. Mr. Hutchings History does a really good job of this. And, it's not quite the superpower image we might have in our heads.
It's fascinating, right? The U.S. is still, really working its way out of the Depression, and we're not a military giant, not yet anyway, not a major player on the world stage. And then, bam, Pearl Harbor happens and everything changes in an instant.
It's hard to grasp how quickly that shift happened. Was it really like an overnight sort of thing?
It really was. Suddenly, winning the war becomes the absolute top priority. And that means completely redirecting the entire economy, almost like flipping a switch. And the speed is mind-boggling.
Okay, so how did they even begin to do that? I mean, overhauling an entire economic engine, a country's economic engine, sounds impossibly complex.
Well, that's where the government stepped in.
Oh.
And they weren't messing around. They created the War Production Board, the WPB. Think of them as like wartime CEOs for the entire nation.
So not just encouraging businesses, they're actually telling them what to make, how to do it.
Exactly.
Wow.
And the podcast gives these amazing examples, like factories that were making silk ribbons were suddenly churning out parachutes.
Really?
Can you imagine that? And it wasn't just small businesses. Giants like Ford and General Motors, they completely stopped making cars and switched to producing tanks and aircraft.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's hard to picture a company like GM, a symbol of American car culture, just saying, nope, no more cars, we're building for the war effort.
Yeah, it was all hands on deck.
It really drives home the scale of this transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, you have to make sure all this new production have the workers it needs. So how do they solve that problem?
So they created the War Manpower Commission. You can almost imagine them coordinating millions of people, making sure the right skills were in the right places, like a giant nationwide game of Tetris, but with, human lives.
Wow. And did businesses just go along with all of this government control? Or was there pushback?
Well, the government was pretty clever about it. They offered these guaranteed contracts, basically saying, focus on war production and we guarantee you'll make a profit. It was a win-win. Companies stayed afloat, and the war effort got the supplies it needed.
That's a pretty brilliant strategy. Appealing to both patriotism and, the bottom line. Makes sense.
And it worked. By 1945, get this, the United States, with only 5% of the world's population, was producing over half of all manufactured goods.
That's a staggering statistic.
It is.
But it wasn't just about, churning out weapons and supplies, right? What about the social impact? The podcast touches on how this whole economic earthquake led to some major shifts in American society, especially for women and minorities.
Right. It's a perfect example of how these massive historical events ripple outwards. The war created this huge demand for labor, and suddenly women and minorities find themselves working in industries that had always been closed to them.
It's that whole Rosie the Riveter image, right? She wasn't just a poster. She represented a real shift in what was considered acceptable, possible even.
Exactly. By 1944, 6 million women were working in war industries. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire population of some countries at the time. And this wasn't just about filling jobs. It was about proving that, women were capable and could handle work previously seen as, just for men. It's a really powerful example of how war, for all its horrors, can sometimes accelerate social change.
And I imagine the impact on minorities was pretty profound as well. The podcast mentions they found new opportunities, but was this, temporary? or did it have lasting effects?
That's a question historians still debate. On the one hand, the war definitely opened doors that were previously slammed shut, but discrimination, segregation, those things remained deeply entrenched. So it was a step forward, but maybe not a giant leap.
Right.
And it's also important to remember that the experiences of different minority groups varied. Like, for African Americans, the war years saw both progress and, a continued struggle for civil rights.
It's a good reminder that even in periods of national unity and shared purpose, the underlying tensions and inequalities, they don't just vanish overnight.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting to look at how different historians interpret this era. Mr. Hutchings' History highlights 4 schools of thought, each offering a unique perspective.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's break down these different interpretations.
Yeah.
First up, the traditionalist view. What's their take?
The traditionalists, they really focus on the big picture, the wins. How the war effectively ended the Depression, propelled the U.S. to superpower status, a very America triumphant narrative.
Makes sense. But I imagine the other perspectives dig a little deeper, look beyond just those purely economic successes.
Exactly. The social history perspective, they shine a light on those social changes. They'd emphasize how the war, maybe unintentionally, became a catalyst for progress, especially for women and minorities.
So, acknowledging those unintended consequences, the ripple effects.
Yeah.
Okay. What about the next one?
The economic determinists take a more critical stance. They're focused on the rise of what we call the military-industrial complex, that close relationship between the government and defense industry. They'd argue this had a major impact on U.S. economic and foreign policy for decades, shaping how we interacted with the world even after the fighting was over.
So not just the immediate victory, but the long-term implications.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the post-revisionists, they try to strike a balance.
What?
They acknowledge that incredible economic boom, the social progress, but they don't shy away from the inequalities that remained, particularly for, women and minorities. It's a more nuanced view.
It sounds like each of these schools of thought offers a valuable piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
It's not about picking the right answer, but understanding how complex this moment in history really was.
You hit the nail on the head, and that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. World War II reshaped the American economy, but the full impact of the social, political, even ethical ramifications, those are still being debated and analyzed today.
And speaking of those ramifications, the podcast does a great job of zooming in on some of the everyday experiences, the things that really bring this transformation to life.
Right.
What were some of the details that really stood out to you?
Well, I was really struck by the whole discussion of rationing. It wasn't just about producing more, it was about consuming less, making do. Can you imagine having limits on things like gasoline, butter, meat, sugar?
It's hard to fathom that kind of shift in lifestyle.
It is.
I mean, today we're so used to just having access to, practically anything we want. What was the timeline for all of this? When did rationing actually begin?
So the podcast lays it all out. It started with gasoline in May of 1942, and then by September, it was nationwide. Coffee was rationed by December, and then by April of 43, they added canned goods, meat, cheese. Really gives you a picture of how much everyday life was impacted.
Wow, that must have been a huge adjustment for people.
It was.
How did they cope?
There was a real make-do and mend spirit. People embraced those victory gardens. Recycling became commonplace. Even the speed limit was lowered to 35 miles an hour to save fuel.
Oh, wow.
It sounds unbelievable today.
It does.
But that was the reality they lived with.
Makes you wonder if we could, learn something from that wartime mentality. I mean, today, facing things like climate change, we talk about the need for conservation, individual action. Could we, tap into that same spirit?
That's such a good question. I think that's something we should definitely explore further. But before we get into that, there's one more piece of this whole economic transformation that I find really fascinating.
Okay, what else caught your eye?
The financial mobilization. The way the U.S. government managed to fund this massive war effort is mind-blowing. It's a story of innovation, persuasion, and, a whole lot of number crunching.
We talked about war bonds a little earlier, but I'm curious about how they went from being just a financial instrument to a cultural phenomenon.
Right. It wasn't just asking people to invest. It was appealing to their patriotism. They had Hollywood stars urging people to buy bonds, athletes rallying the crowds, posters everywhere, brilliant marketing, but also a real sense of national unity.
It really does make you wonder if that kind of campaign could even work today. I mean, we're living in a much more cynical time.
It's hard to say, but I think there are lessons to be learned from how they framed the challenge. tapped into that shared purpose.
Yeah, I think you're right.
You know, if the cause is compelling enough, if people believe that their actions can make a difference, maybe we could see that wartime spirit again.
It's a thought-provoking idea. And it highlights another key aspect of this transformation, the role of government. The level of intervention was unprecedented, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The war essentially gave the government a mandate to take control of the economy in a way that, would have been unthinkable during peacetime.
Right.
It really raises questions about individual liberty and collective action, questions that are still relevant today.
And as we talked about, those actions had these ripple effects that went way beyond the war itself. Changes in social norms, gender roles, even the relationship between government and industry, those were all unintended consequences, but they had a huge impact.
You're so right. It's like the decisions we make today, even those made with, the best of intentions, can have consequences we can't always predict.
Right.
It's a reminder to be humble, to recognize that our actions create these ripples that go way beyond our immediate goals.
Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our dive. We've explored that initial shock of Pearl Harbor, the government's intervention, the social changes, the financial wizardry. Phew, it's a lot.
And we've only scratched the surface.
I know, right?
We still have those lingering consequences to discuss, different schools of thought and lessons we can apply to today's challenges.
I'm already hooked. This has been a fantastic start to our deep dive. I can't wait to see where we go next.
It's amazing how one single event like Pearl Harbor could set off this chain reaction of change.
It is, yeah. Really makes you think about those tipping points in history, how something unimaginable one day just becomes the new normal. And for me, what's striking is that it wasn't just about reacting to the attack. It was about rethinking, reimagining what America could be economically and socially.
Yeah, that's a good point. The war forced America to kind of confront its own potential, to push beyond what anyone thought was possible.
And one place we see that is in just the sheer scale of the industrial output.
You're talking about that stat, right? That by 1945, the U.S. was producing more than half the world's manufactured goods.
Yeah, with only 5% of the population. How is that even possible?
It almost doesn't compute, does it? And it wasn't just turning car factories into tank factories. They had to optimize every step of production, from getting the raw materials to the finished product.
And I remember the podcast mentioned farm mechanization, too.
Oh, right.
With so many farm workers being drafted, they had to find ways to produce more food with fewer people.
And the impact was huge. According to the podcast, in 1944, American farms were churning out 477 million more bushels of corn and 324 million more bushels of wheat than in 1939. And they did it all with a shrinking workforce. Pretty amazing, right? That ingenuity, that American can-do spirit, it really shines through.
It does, yeah. It makes you wonder, could we, replicate that today, even without a war pushing us?
That's the question, isn't it? It's hard to compare because the context was so unique. There was this clear and present danger, this feeling of national unity that's, it's hard to find these days.
That's true.
But it shows what we can achieve when we all work together toward a shared goal.
And speaking of shared goals, one thing that really impressed me was how the government got everyday Americans to buy in to this massive economic shift.
The war bonds campaign.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Getting 85 million people to buy war bonds, that's incredible.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about financial incentives either.
No, it was deeper than that.
It was about tapping into that sense of patriotism,
Absolutely. That sense of shared sacrifice. They really used every tool they had. Hollywood, sports, you name it. It was marketing genius, but also a testament to that genuine national unity.
And it's not just the bonds. It's also the rationing we talked about earlier.
Right, those limitations on everyday goods. You'd think people would have pushed back hard.
I would have thought so, too.
But the podcast says there was actually very little resistance. People understood the necessity of it, everyone doing their part for the war effort.
It's remarkable, isn't it? Today we see so much pushback against even the slightest inconvenience. What changed?
Well, I think it goes back to that shared purpose, that feeling of we're all in this together. During the war, you had a clear enemy, a common goal. It's a lot tougher to create that kind of unity in peacetime, especially now with the world being so, fragmented.
Yeah, I see your point.
But the thing is, even back then, America wasn't perfect. The podcast is very upfront about that. Racism, sexism, all those social problems, they were still there.
Oh, absolutely. We can't romanticize this era.
Definitely not. But even with those flaws, there's something powerful about that ability to pull together when faced with a huge challenge.
So that brings us back to those different schools of thought, each one offering a different perspective on this complex period.
Exactly. So the traditionalists might look at the economic success story, but the social historians would focus on how the war, even with its imperfections, led to social changes.
And the economic determinists would warn us about the growth of the military-industrial complex. And the post-revisionists, they remind us that progress isn't always, a straight line. Inequalities still exist, even in times of change.
It's like we're looking at a diamond. Each side reflects a different aspect of the story. And it's up to us to consider all those sides, weigh the evidence, and come to our own conclusions.
So after all this talk about factories and farms, war bonds, and ration books, what's the big takeaway? What's the one thing you really want our listeners to walk away with?
For me, it's realizing that history isn't just dates and battles. It's about the choices people make, the sacrifices they endure, and, the unexpected consequences that echo down through time.
And the home front during World War II, it's such a powerful example of that. It's a story of innovation and adaptation and a collective spirit that, it's hard to imagine today.
Yeah, it is.
But it's also a story about those enduring challenges, those inequalities that linger, even when everyone's supposed to be united.
That's right. Which leads us to maybe the most important question of all. What can we learn from all this? Can we take those lessons, those insights, and use them to face the challenges of today, like climate change, social inequality, conflicts around the world?
That's a great question.
And I think that's really the legacy of this era, It's a challenge to each of us to learn from the past and use it to build a better future. It's interesting to think that even while the war was still raging, the U.S. government was already thinking about what came next, like planning for the post-war world.
Yeah, it really shows you they were thinking ahead.
They knew that, winning the war was only half the battle. The real challenge would be rebuilding.
And reshaping the world that emerged from all that destruction.
Yeah.
And one of the most significant pieces of that puzzle was, the GI Bill.
Oh,
officially known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act.
It was revolutionary, really, providing veterans with, funding for housing and education,
Right.
opening up opportunities that many of them wouldn't have had before the war.
So it was more than just thanking them for their service.
Right.
It was investing in their future.
And in a way, the future of the entire nation.
It's often credited with, really fueling that post-war economic boom, right? Creating all these new homeowners, educated professionals, entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. The GI Bill is a fantastic example of how these really targeted policies can have a huge impact for generations.
And it wasn't just focused on the home front either.
No, it wasn't.
The U.S. also emerged from the war as this global leader.
Right, taking on a whole new role.
Like shaping the world order.
Exactly. And a prime example of that is the creation of the World Bank in December 1945,
Right.
with the U.S. contributing over $3 billion. It showed just how much the U.S. was stepping up, not just a participant anymore, but really an architect of this new world.
So, in just a few short years, the U.S. goes from struggling with the Depression to leading the charge in rebuilding the world.
Yeah, pretty remarkable.
It's a huge shift, but, like we've been talking about, not without its complexities.
Right, and that's where those four schools of historical thought, those different perspectives that can really help us understand this era.
Let's revisit those one by one, starting with the traditionalist view. How would they sum up this whole period?
So the traditionalists, they would likely focus on those positive outcomes, the economic boom, becoming a superpower, defeating fascism. They might argue that the war, despite all the tragedy, really brought America out of the Depression onto the world stage.
Set the stage for, decades of prosperity.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about the social history perspective? How would they see things?
They'd likely focus on the social changes the war brought about, especially the roles of women and minorities in the workforce. They might see it as a moment of progress, breaking down barriers.
Even if, there was still work to be done in terms of true equality.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then the economic determinists, what's their main takeaway?
They would likely focus on the rise of the military-industrial complex.
Okay.
They'd argue that the close ties between the government and the defense industry that were really forged during the war, that those ties had a lasting effect.
On foreign policy as well?
On U.S. economics, foreign policy, everything. It shaped the nation's priorities for decades to come.
And finally, the post-revisionists. What's their angle?
They would offer a more balanced perspective, I think, acknowledging the good and the bad,
Okay.
highlighting the inequalities that persisted while also recognizing the progress made. They'd caution us against, looking at the past with rose-colored glasses.
It's so interesting how the same events can be viewed in such different ways.
It is, isn't it?
It reminds us that history is like constantly being interpreted, reinterpreted.
Exactly. And the value of looking at those different views is that it makes us think critically, question what we believe, see that there are multiple truths.
So after this deep dive into World War II's impact,
Yeah.
is there a question you want our listeners to really think about?
I think the most important one is, what lessons can we take from this whole experience? Can we use those lessons to tackle today's challenges? Climate change, social inequalities, conflicts, all of it.
Yeah.
I think that's the true legacy of this period, that challenge to each of us to learn from the past and use it to create a better future.
That's a great point. And it reminds us that history isn't some dusty old thing,
Yeah.
It's alive. It shapes who we are and how we see the world.
Absolutely. And by understanding it, grappling with those complexities, we gain these valuable insights. It helps us make better decisions, build stronger communities, create a more just and sustainable world.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, maybe even a little inspiring. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.